I really like Jonathan Joestar. In fact, I think he might be my favourite of all the protagonists throughout JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Stop the presses, some guy on the internet has a slightly unusual opinion. In all seriousness, while I might be biased as someone who had the misfortune of being born a Brit, I do genuinely feel like Jonathan is underrated as a character. And you can see this in online threads talking about people's favourite JoJo protagonists, where Jonathan typically stays at or near the bottom of people's rankings. People really dislike Jonathan, but also really feel strongly about him due to things like him lacking the flamboyancy and intrigue of the other main characters. But hopefully I can change some people's minds about this. Let's start by summarising Jonathan as a character, and then I'll go on to talk about why I like him and think he's interesting. Jonathan is the son of a rich man, George Joestar. He grew up without a mother under his father's strict teachings and ideals. These ideals imprinted the goal of being a gentleman onto Jonathan, which often underlies his motivations and actions throughout the story. The meaning of what a gentleman isn't really conveyed in Phantom Blood, but we do learn about some aspects of it, such as the importance of protecting women, even if it means entering a losing battle, maintaining proper table manners, fighting fairly and not attacking someone who is defenseless. Jonathan struggles with being a gentleman as a child, despite his best efforts. As a child, Jonathan is also easily upset by seeing cruelty, unfairness, and general evil practices, where he finds it necessary to stand up for the victims of these actions, and this is maintained into Jonathan's adulthood. Although when it comes to calm situations, Jonathan is much quieter and more mild-mannered as an adult than he was as a child. Another thing which is maintained into Jonathan's adulthood is his natural sense of curiosity. He is fascinated by the stone mask, which drives him to research it. But unlike Dio, he never tests the stone mask on another human. It seems like his curiosity falls short of his need to treat people well. Towards the end of the story, after Jonathan defeats Dio, he goes on to marry Erina Pendleton, his childhood girlfriend who moved away when Jonathan was growing up. The relationship between the two is wholesome, but simple and frankly uninteresting. On the way to their honeymoon, Jonathan boards a ship which Dio's severed but still living head is on. This head proceeds to kill Jonathan, but in his last moments, as the ship is sinking and about to explode, Jonathan cradles Dio's head in his arms, and admits to himself that despite everything, he still feels a bizarre friendship towards Dio. He doesn't forgive him, but he can't bring himself to hate even the worst of humanity. What a guy. We can also point out a few other key aspects of Jonathan, such as his bravery, kindness, and determination, which underlie his drive to defeat Dio, his cunningness in battle, which saves him many times throughout the story, and his tendency to be strengthened by adversity. The manga also has a few minor details about Jonathan as a child, which are left out in the anime, such as him being superstitious, being easily cheered up by chocolate when sad, showing some bad behaviour in smoking a pipe, and also multiple accounts of animal abuse, including throwing rocks at Danny as a kid, and swinging around frogs by strings tied to their legs. It's understandable why the anime left that bit out, but there's no indication that Jonathan still does any of these things as an adult. And kids just do stuff like that when left alone. I'm not going to read too much into it. It's very easy to predict what Jonathan will do throughout the story. He will help people in need, he will fight people he views as evil, he will treat people politely and with respect if they get back to him, he will get angry at provocations, and he will mourn the loss of his loved ones and find strength from it. All of these traits are very common in a hero, and unlike the other of the JoJo's, Jonathan pretty much never does anything shocking. So if Jonathan's so simple, why did I claim that he's interesting? We're going to have to dig a little deeper. In past interviews and volume notes, Araki has noted that Phantom Blood's main themes are being alive, an affirmation that humanity is wonderful, the passing of the torch, and how people leave parts of themselves behind for the next generation when they die. The first theme, being alive, is quite vague, but I think it's shown in the battle between the living and the dead throughout the part, with Jonathan taking the role of the living, although it could also relate to the later themes of being around to inherit things from others. The second theme, an affirmation that humanity is wonderful, is more interesting, and explains a lot about Jonathan's character, where to me it seems like Jonathan is intended to exemplify the best things humanity has to offer, such as bravery, empathy, and strength. And to support this idea, Jonathan also has little in terms of flaws, his main ones being that he is too trusting and simply not being as strong as he needs to be sometimes. This is kept in contrast with Dio, who seems to exemplify the worst parts of humanity in both his actions and his personality, to the point where Speedwagon claims that Dio had been evil since the day he was born. In the past, Araki has said in interviews that he was unsure of what to do with Jonathan as a protagonist, and I think this explains why Jonathan is kept so simple. Araki did not want to risk making Jonathan too flamboyant or complex, in case it muddled the message of Jonathan representing the best of us somehow. We know that Araki was capable of writing complex and flamboyant characters like Dio and Zeppeli, but it seems like Jonathan's function as a vehicle for the story's themes was prioritized above him having the same complexity as the story's other characters, which would explain why he's kind of shallow as a character. The next two themes, the passing of the torch and how people leave parts of themselves behind for the next generations when they die, are seen in Jonathan as well, through inheriting the wills, hopes, and strengths from both his father and Zeppeli after their deaths, as well as Bruford's sword in a more literal inheritance. All of this also fuels his anger towards Dio, and makes up Jonathan's motivations for the story. As X-Forts points out in his own video about Jonathan, Jonathan's valiant and effectively perfect nature helps us to understand that the main characters of the future parts will also have a heroic aspect to them, as they are Jonathan's descendants, despite often being far less good-natured. I'd highly recommend watching X-Forts' video, Is Jonathan Boring?, for more on this idea. It would be very easy for me to claim that Jonathan's simplicity is intentional, and therefore clever and interesting. But first of all, as I mentioned earlier, this isn't actually true, particularly as it is possible to have a character who both conveys themes properly and is interesting at the same time, like we see with the other JoJos. And I'm sure Araki would have liked to achieve that if he had the confidence and experience to see it through. I think it's fair to claim that Jonathan isn't as cleverly written as his descendants, and moreover, even though there are cleverly written aspects of Jonathan, it doesn't necessarily make him an entertaining character to watch. And frankly, while I personally enjoy watching Jonathan's antics, I can't convince you that he's any more fun than you find him. But that's only as far as Phantom Blood as a story is concerned. What if we looked beyond the Jonathan showed to us by Araki? It's not really sensible to support a character based on their potential rather than what they actually are, like I'm intending to do with Jonathan in a moment. But for me, part of enjoying and liking both characters and people comes in seeing the kind of person they have the potential of becoming. For people, if someone has admirable goals, I'm going to like them more. And for characters, if I feel they have the potential to be made fascinating, if they're ever returned to in some way, I can like them for that. Again, while this would be bad practice as a good critic, I am a gremlin bastard, so I'm going to talk about Jonathan's potential intrigue as a character that could be uncovered in either future media with Jonathan in, or if Phantom Blood wanted to focus on him as a character, rather than as a vehicle for the story's main themes. But to lead up to that, let's talk a bit about the time period that Phantom Blood was made in, and what that has meant for Jonathan as a character. In Super Eyepatch Wolf's video, Why You Should Watch JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 1, he points out that Jonathan is likely inspired by the trend for main characters in action manga to punch hard, say little, and be built like a house, or in other words, to be stoic, masculine, and mysterious, as was trendy in 1987, when Phantom Blood was first written. Good examples of this would be Rambo, the Terminator, or Kenshiro from Fist of the North Star. But if we compare Jonathan to those characters, we find that Jonathan actually breaks some aspects of the trend in a notable way. For example, he is considerably more excitable, empathetic, and emotional than was usual for the time. And so we could even say that Jonathan was an unusually complicated protagonist for an action story at the time Phantom Blood was written. In the modern day, however, Jonathan's character pales in complexity compared to many of the protagonists of our time, who frequently have deep-seated flaws, complex motivations, or constant ideological challenges, such as Attack on Titan's Eren Yeager, Mob Psycho's Kageyama Shigeo, and Fullmetal Alchemist's Edward Elric. Not to say that those characters are more well written than Jonathan, although I think they are, but rather to say that the standards for complexity a main character should contain have changed over time, and have increased since the period Phantom Blood was written. And in this sense, while Jonathan Joestar may have been intriguing before, he now feels flat and stale. But in fairness, maybe it'll be the same in 40 years' time for the modern characters we know and love today, as literature and storytelling continue to develop. In other words, Jonathan Joestar's character could be said to have aged poorly. But while I wouldn't disagree with that conclusion, I think he still contains a lot of potential to be made interesting if Phantom Blood as a story was focused more on Jonathan as a person, rather than using him to convey the story's main themes, as I mentioned earlier. I think we may even be able to develop levels of intrigue in Jonathan comparable to modern-day protagonists. And as I'm talking about Jonathan as a protagonist, rather than Phantom Blood as a story, I'm going to give myself a free pass to talk about story changes despite it generally being bad practice to do this sort of thing. Essentially, I'm going to attempt to modernize Jonathan as a character. So let's talk about some ideas for story changes that would bring Jonathan's underlying complexity to the forefront. In general, the modern story will look into a character's flaws on any number of dynamics, most often things like personality and ideals, and Jonathan could be developed on both of these dynamics, which may lead to some interesting scenarios and character development. To start with, let's talk about Jonathan's morality and the idea of the gentleman. While we hear time and time again about how important being a gentleman is to Jonathan, we don't actually know much about what it entails for him, and what kinds of sacrifices it takes to be a proper one. Does being forced to maintain being a gentleman ever inconvenience him in daily life? Does he frequently have to quell his feelings about things? Do the high standards he expects himself to uphold ever take a toll on him mentally? Also, how does Jonathan handle morally difficult circumstances? For example, towards the end of Phantom Blood, Dio turns a woman into a zombie, who then proceeds to eat her own baby. How would Jonathan feel about fighting that woman? Maybe he would feel uncomfortable, but fight her on behalf of her no longer being human, and therefore not necessary to protect as a gentleman. Or maybe he'd refuse to fight entirely. It's questions like these which give us a deeper insight into Jonathan as a person, and I think it would be fascinating to hear about it, especially seeing as while Jonathan's ideals are clearly stated, they lack the depth necessary to explain how he deals with different situations. Additionally, maybe Jonathan's straightforward nature means he can't deal with difficult situations like these well, leading him into trouble, particularly as Dio could learn to exploit this to gain the upper hand in a fight. Another aspect of Jonathan which it might be interesting to see more about is his curiosity. We know that the stone mask piques his interest, which leads him to study archaeology, and to dedicate his life up to that point to researching it. Maybe this curiosity could be another thing which leads him into trouble. We can be sure that Jonathan's curiosity would not lead him to hurt people unnecessarily, but maybe there could be a bit about how Jonathan's interest in ancient history leads him into a rough situation. This could particularly happen at around the point of the Bruford and Tarkus fights. Maybe Jonathan ends up going into the ancient ruins to look for Dio, and is unable to stop his curiosity from leading him further and further in, until he is ambushed by Tarkus and put into an even more dangerous situation than the one the original Tarkus fight happens in. Maybe Dio could utilize the historical ruins of the area around Midnight Slot's castle as cover in their fight, which Jonathan wouldn't be able to bring himself to attack through, as it would mean damaging valuable archaeological structures and history. There are any number of ways Jonathan's curiosity could be exploited to create traps, or disadvantageous fighting circumstances leading to some fascinating combat scenarios. A weakness of Jonathan which gets explored a little in Phantom Blood, but only briefly and without much major consequence, is his trust in others and his hope for humanity. Dio attempts to manipulate this a couple of times in order to attack Jonathan, but is thwarted both times. Maybe this could be something which leads to actual consequences for him. Perhaps Dio could have used this to gain the upper hand in their battle at the castle, by pretending to surrender and attempt to gain Jonathan's forgiveness, only to then attack him. Or maybe Jonathan could have his love for humanity tested by being shown the worst parts of normal people, rather than the worst parts of cartoonishly evil villains like Dio. Would Jonathan still be willing to help a murderer in need? Would Jonathan want to follow through on his mission to save humanity from Dio's control? If he understood the horrible things people sometimes do to other people and animals, could Jonathan possibly be manipulated by Dio to join his side, even if only temporarily by appealing to the idea that humans aren't actually worth saving? A few of the minor things which I think could be worth exploring are also Jonathan's familial pride, which seems to stop somewhat short of his need to do the right thing, as evidenced by him burning down the Joestar manor to try and kill Dio. Maybe this could be called out and be a point of conflict for Jonathan. Also, we see time and time again how emotional and easy to anger Jonathan is. In fact, this element of straightforwardness for Jonathan could be something which Jonathan needs to grow beyond. He may need to become more sporadic, both in fighting and in general life. Being more sporadic in combat would help make him a less predictable fighter, and there are any number of ways being more sporadic could be useful in day-to-day life. For example, it could help him deal with the vibrant and strange people he comes across in his adventure. There are many ways to complicate Jonathan as a protagonist, but there's also no reason why all of these couldn't be explored at the same time, portraying Jonathan not as a perfect human and the best humanity has to offer, but rather as a more realistic depiction of how a great person is often someone who is able to overcome or accept their weaknesses, and use the experiences gained from that to become a stronger and better person, which may even be a better communication of how humanity can be wonderful. Jonathan Joestar is a character who, simply put, has aged poorly, but we can still see how cleverly written he is sometimes, and how there are many aspects of him that still hold up today and are genuinely great. There are also lots of elements to him which are unexplored but could be used to create a very interesting character-focused story, but it seems like Araki's decision to have Jonathan be a vehicle for the story's themes, rather than a complex character, means that doing so would not make sense unless the story was changed completely. However, if the story were to be changed in this way to focus on Jonathan, I believe we could definitely see greatness in him comparable to the other Joestars, and also many of the most well-loved characters of our time. I really do love this big blue oaf, and I hope I've convinced you to like him a little more as well.